November 1941, somewhere over the North Sea. Hauptmann Werner Streib stared through the armoured glass of his Messerschmitt 110 night fighter, his eyes straining against the darkness. The coastal radar stations had reported a single British aircraft, designation unknown, crossing into German airspace at high altitude. Streib was the Luftwaffe's leading night fighter ace with 33 confirmed kills, and he expected this to be another easy victory. British bombers at night were slow, predictable targets, little more than flying coffins once a skilled night fighter caught them in the darkness. But when his radar operator finally acquired the target and Streib closed to visual range, he saw something that made no sense. The aircraft silhouetted against the moonlit clouds was small, twin-engined, and moving fast, far faster than any bomber he had encountered. He pushed his throttles forward, the Daimler-Benz engines howling as he tried to close the distance. The British aircraft seemed to be flying straight and level, almost contemptuously unconcerned about the German fighter behind it. Streib lined up his shot, his finger hovering over the firing button for his 4 20mm cannon and 5 7.9mm machine guns. Then the British pilot must have spotted him, because the aircraft suddenly accelerated. Streib watched in disbelief as the twin-engine plane simply pulled away from his night fighter, opening the distance with ease. He pushed his throttles past the limit markers, straining his engines, but the British aircraft just kept pulling ahead until it vanished into the darkness. When Streib returned to base and filed his combat report, he described the encounter with frustration and confusion. The British aircraft had outrun him at altitude, something no bomber should be able to do. His commanding officer was sceptical. German intelligence knew of no British aircraft with such performance. Streib's report was filed and largely ignored. But over the next several months similar reports would accumulate. A wooden British aircraft that flew too fast to catch, too high to intercept, and seemed to appear and disappear at will. German pilots began calling it the Mosquito, and they were not laughing. The de Havilland Mosquito had its origins in a 1938 concept that the British Air Ministry initially rejected as insane. Geoffrey de Havilland, the legendary aircraft designer whose company had been building aircraft since World War I, proposed building a bomber entirely from wood. Not because wood was cheaper or easier to work with, but because a wooden aircraft could be built by furniture makers and carpenters, freeing up precious aluminum and steel for other aircraft. More importantly, de Havilland believed that a sleek, aerodynamically refined wooden bomber powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines and carrying no defensive armament could simply outrun enemy fighters, making guns and armour unnecessary weight. The Air Ministry's initial response was polite but firm rejection. Every military aviation expert knew that modern bombers needed defensive armament. The entire philosophy of British bomber design centred on heavily armed aircraft that could fight their way through enemy defences. A bomber without guns was a bomber that couldn't defend itself, and would. That was a material for training aircraft, not frontline combat machines. Metal was stronger, more durable, more resistant to battle damage. Building a modern high-performance bomber from wood was like trying to fight World War II with cavalry. It was romantic, perhaps, but fundamentally impractical. But de Havilland was persistent, and he had powerful allies. Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, a member of the Air Council, recognised that de Havilland's concept had merit. If Britain went to war, and everyone knew war was coming, the aluminium shortage would be crippling. Anything that could be built without consuming strategic materials deserved consideration. Freeman pushed the concept through bureaucratic resistance, and in December 1939, with the war already begun, de Havilland received a contract for 50 aircraft. Even then, the order came with scepticism. The Air Ministry hedged its bets, specifying that the Mosquito should be adaptable as a bomber, a reconnaissance aircraft, or a fighter. Nobody really believed it would excel at any of those roles. The prototype took shape in the de Havilland factory at Hatfield during 1940, while the Battle of Britain raged overhead. The construction technique was revolutionary. The fuselage was built in 2 halves, each constructed from a sandwich of birch plywood skins over a balsa wood core. This composite structure was incredibly strong for its weight, much stronger than an equivalent structure of aluminum. The 2 halves were joined along a central keel. Then the entire fuselage was covered in doped fabric before receiving its final coat of paint. The wings used a similar construction, with spruce spars and plywood skins creating a structure that was both lightweight and remarkably rigid. The choice of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was inspired. the same engine that powered the Spitfire and Hurricane fighters that were saving Britain from the Luftwaffe would power the Mosquito. But where fighters used a single Merlin, the Mosquito would have two, giving it over 2,000 horsepower total. This was an enormous amount of power for an aircraft that weighed less than 14,000 pounds empty. The power-to-weight ratio was comparable to fighters, not bombers. De Havilland understood that this power, combined with exceptionally clean aerodynamics, would give the Mosquito performance that would shock everyone who saw it fly. The first prototype flew on November 25, 1940, and immediately demonstrated capabilities that exceeded even de Havilland's optimistic predictions. Test pilot Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the designer's son, reported that the aircraft handled like a fighter, despite having two engines and a substantial fuel load. Maximum speed was over 380 miles per hour at altitude, faster than most fighters in service. Climb rate was exceptional. Service ceiling was over 35,000 feet. And perhaps most importantly, the aircraft was a joy to fly. The controls were light and responsive. Visibility was excellent through the large greenhouse canopy, and the two Merlins provided smooth, reliable power. But the Air Ministry remained sceptical. A wooden bomber that flew like a fighter sounded too good to be true, and in military procurement, things that sound too good to be true usually are. The Mosquito would have to prove itself in combat before the doubters would be convinced. The first operational unit, 105 Squadron, began receiving Mosquitoes in November 1941 and started flying missions in May 1942. These early missions were reconnaissance flights deep into German territory, using the Mosquito's speed and altitude to avoid interception. The results were extraordinary. Mosquitoes routinely penetrated German airspace, photographed targets, and returned without being caught by German fighters. The bomber version demonstrated its capabilities in a spectacular fashion on September 25, 1942. 4 Mosquitoes attacked the Gestapo headquarters in Oslo, Norway in broad daylight, flying at low altitude beneath German radar. They released their bombs with precision, destroying the target, and escaped before German fighters could react. The raid demonstrated that the Mosquito could operate in ways that conventional bombers could not. It was fast enough to avoid fighters, agile enough to fly at very low altitude, and accurate enough to hit specific buildings without causing excessive civilian casualties. This combination of capabilities made it invaluable for precision strikes against targets where heavy bomber raids would cause unacceptable collateral damage. German pilots encountering the Mosquito for the first time went through a predictable sequence of reactions. First came surprise at seeing a twin-engined aircraft operating alone deep in German airspace. Then came the attack run, confident that this strange British bomber would be an easy kill. Then came shock, as the Mosquito simply accelerated away from the pursuing fighter. Finally came the frustrated combat report describing an aircraft that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. Luftwaffe intelligence began compiling these reports, trying to understand what the British had created. The analysis conducted by German technical intelligence in early 1942 read like something from a fantasy novel. The British had apparently built a bomber from wood that was faster than the Focke-Wulf 190 at most altitudes. It could cruise at 300 miles per hour, a speed at which German bombers would tear themselves apart. It could operate at altitudes where most German fighters struggled. It carried a respectable bomb load of 2,000 pounds, enough to cause serious damage to any target. And it did all of this with a crew of only 2, compared to the 7 or more crew members on a typical heavy bomber. The report concluded that the Mosquito represented a serious threat that current German fighters would struggle to counter. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, reportedly flew into a rage when shown the intelligence reports on the Mosquito. The British had built a high-performance combat aircraft from wood, a material that Germany had dismissed as obsolete, and this wooden aircraft was outperforming German fighters built from strategic aluminum. Göring demanded that German industry develop a similar aircraft, but German designers explained that this was impossible. The Mosquito worked because of unique British expertise in wooden aircraft construction, expertise that Germany had abandoned years earlier in favour of all-metal designs. Germany could not simply copy the Mosquito. They would have to develop countermeasures instead. The countermeasures proved difficult to implement. The Mosquito's high speed meant that it could only be intercepted by the fastest German fighters, and even then only under favourable conditions. The Focke-Wulf 190, The Luftwaffe's best daytime fighter in 1942 could reach 410 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, giving it a marginal speed advantage over the Mosquito at that altitude. But the Mosquito could operate higher, where the Focke-Wulf's performance degraded, or it could operate lower, using its exceptional low-altitude speed to simply run away from pursuers. German pilots learned that catching a Mosquito required perfect positioning, excellent teamwork, and considerable luck. Most interception attempts failed. The night fighter version of the Mosquito, designated the NF Mk2, entered service in early 1942 and immediately proved itself superior to every other night fighter in the world. It combined the speed and altitude performance of the bomber version with AI MAK-4 radar, 4 20mm cannon in the belly, and 4 .303 caliber machine guns in the nose. The result was a night fighter that could catch any German bomber and destroy it with a devastating weight of fire. Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham, who would become the RAF's leading night fighter ace, scored his first Mosquito kill in January 1942 and never looked back. The Mosquito could patrol at high altitude for hours, waiting for German bombers to appear on radar, then dive on them with overwhelming speed advantage. German bomber crews quickly learned to fear the Mosquito. Unlike the heavy British night fighters that could sometimes be evaded through violent manoeuvring, the Mosquito could follow bombers through any manoeuvre and still have speed in reserve. The 4 20mm cannon were devastating against bomber targets. A 2-second burst put 40 high explosive shells into the target, enough to destroy any aircraft ever built. Survivors of Mosquito attacks described seeing their bombers literally disintegrate under the impact of cannon fire with wings and tail sections separating from fuselages in showers of debris. The psychological impact was severe. German bomber crews knew that if a Mosquito found them, they were probably going to die. By mid-1943, the Mosquito was operating in multiple roles across all theatres of war. Bomber versions were conducting precision strikes on targets throughout occupied Europe. Photo reconnaissance variants were mapping enemy territory with impunity. Fighter bomber versions were attacking shipping and ground targets with devastating effectiveness. And night fighter versions were decimating German bomber formations over Britain, and later over Germany itself. No other aircraft in any air force could match this versatility. The Mosquito could do anything, and do it better than specialized aircraft designed for those specific roles. The photo reconnaissance role deserves special attention, because this is where the Mosquito's combination of speed and altitude proved most valuable. PR Mosquitoes, stripped of armament and bombs to save weight, and fitted with additional fuel tanks, could reach 40,000 feet, and cruise at speeds that made interception nearly impossible. They routinely photographed targets deep in Germany, sometimes flying the entire length of the country at altitudes where German fighters could barely reach them. On one notable mission in December 1943, a PR Mosquito photographed Berlin in broad daylight, flying back and forth over the German capital while Luftwaffe fighters climbed desperately but futilely to reach it. The photographs from that mission were used to plan future bombing raids, and the propaganda value was immense. The British could fly over Hitler's capital in daylight, and there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do about it. German attempts to counter the high-altitude PR Mosquitoes led to increasingly desperate measures. Special high-altitude versions of the Messerschmitt 109 were developed, with pressurized cockpits and enlarged wings to improve performance above 40,000 feet. These aircraft could theoretically reach the altitude where Mosquitoes operated, but in practice they were difficult to fly and rarely achieved successful interceptions. The Mosquito pilots, warned by British radar of German fighters scrambling to intercept them, would simply climb higher or accelerate away. The speed advantage of the Mosquito at altitude was so significant that even if a German fighter reached the right altitude and got into position, the Mosquito could just leave whenever it wanted. The bomber variants of the Mosquito pioneered tactics that would later be adopted by other forces. Pathfinder Mosquitoes would arrive ahead of heavy bomber streams, marking targets with coloured flares for the following bombers. Nuisance raids by small numbers of Mosquitoes would disrupt German air defences and force the population into shelters, degrading war production. Precision strikes on specific industrial targets or transportation, choke points could achieve strategic results with a handful of aircraft, and all of this was done with minimal losses. Mosquito loss rates were a fraction of those suffered by heavy bombers, typically under 1% per mission compared to 5% or more for Lancaster and Halifax bombers. The Mosquito's wooden construction, initially seen as a limitation, proved to be an advantage in several unexpected ways. Wood absorbed damage better than aluminum. Cannon shells and machine gun bullets would punch through wood, leaving relatively small holes, whereas aluminum structures would crack and fail catastrophically. Mosquitoes returned from missions with dozens of bullet holes that would have downed metal aircraft. The wood structure was also transparent to radar, at least the early radar systems used by German night fighters. This made mosquitoes harder to detect and track, giving them an additional layer of protection. But the most significant advantage of wooden construction was production. Mosquitoes were built in dispersed factories, furniture workshops, and even piano manufacturers. This meant that German bombing raids on aircraft factories had little effect on mosquito production. If a factory building Lancasters was destroyed, Lancaster production stopped. If a furniture factory building mosquito fuselages was destroyed, production shifted to another furniture factory. The distributed production network made the Mosquito virtually immune to strategic bombing. By war's end, over 7,700 Mosquitoes had been built, an impressive number given that each aircraft required thousands of hours of skilled carpentry. The fighter-bomber version of the Mosquito, armed with 4 20mm cannon, 4 303 machine guns, and capability to carry bombs or rockets, became the scourge of German shipping and transportation. FB Mackay 6. Mosquitoes operating with Coastal Command attacked German shipping in Norwegian fjords and along the occupied coast, sinking vessels with bombs and rockets before racing away faster than escorting German fighters could respond. Railway interdiction missions saw Mosquitoes attacking locomotives, bridges and rail yards, crippling German logistics. The speed and agility that made the Mosquito a successful bomber made it an even more devastating strike aircraft. It could penetrate to targets at low altitude, hit with precision, and escape before defences could react. The most famous Mosquito operations combined precision, daring, and the aircraft's unique capabilities in ways that captured public imagination. Operation Jericho, the attack on Amiens prison in February 1944, saw 19 Mosquitoes fly at ultra-low altitude across occupied France to precisely bomb the prison walls, allowing French resistance fighters to escape. The bombing was so accurate that the outer walls were breached while the inner sections where prisoners were held remained intact. 3 Mosquitoes were lost, but 258 prisoners escaped. Operation Carthage. The attack on Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen in March 1940 saw 18 Mosquitoes bomb the building with such precision that the target was destroyed while surrounding civilian structures remained largely undamaged. These operations demonstrated capabilities that no other aircraft possessed. The combination of speed for survival, range for deep penetration, and accuracy for precision strikes made the Mosquito irreplaceable. German pilots' attitudes toward the Mosquito evolved from initial mockery to grudging respect to outright fear. Early in the war, the idea of a wooden bomber was laughable. By mid-war, the Mosquito was recognized as a serious threat that required specific tactics to counter. By late war, encountering a Mosquito meant you were probably going to die. The night fighter variants were particularly feared. German bomber crews called them Mosquito Panic, the terror of seeing the characteristic twin-engine silhouette appearing out of the darkness and knowing that cannon fire would follow in seconds. Hauptmann Martin Drews, a German night fighter ace with 52 victories, encountered Mosquito night fighters on multiple occasions and survived to describe the experience. He later wrote that the Mosquito was the only Allied aircraft he truly feared. It was faster than his Messerschmitt 110, more manoeuvrable despite having 2 engines, and carried devastating firepower. Worse, Mosquito pilots were typically highly experienced and knew how to use their aircraft's advantages. In a night fight between a German night fighter and a Mosquito, the odds favoured the British. Drews described one encounter where a Mosquito attacked his aircraft from behind. Only violent evasive manoeuvres and emergency power from his engines saved him. Even then, his aircraft took multiple cannon hits that could have been fatal if they'd struck critical systems. The specialized versions of the Mosquito demonstrated just how flexible the basic design was. The FB Mk 70, nicknamed the Setzi, mounted a 57mm anti-tank gun in the nose. This weapon, one of the largest guns ever fitted to an aircraft, could destroy ships, submarines, and heavily armoured targets with a single hit. The high-altitude PR variants could operate at 43,000 feet, higher than virtually any other aircraft in the war. The Sea Mosquito, designed for carrier operations, proved that even a large twin-engine aircraft could operate from carriers if properly designed. Trainer versions taught new pilots how to handle multi-engine aircraft. Transport versions carried high-priority cargo and passengers at speeds that made interception unlikely. No other airframe in World War II was adapted to so many different roles. The engine development that paralleled Mosquito development deserves attention, because the increases in engine power directly translated to increases in aircraft performance. The original Mosquito prototypes used Merlin 21 engines producing 1,760 horsepower each. By 1943, Merlin 25 engines were producing 635 horsepower. The 1944 Merlin 113 and 114 engines produced over 1,700 horsepower, with water methanol injection. These power increases, combined with aerodynamic refinements, pushed the Mosquito's maximum speed from 380 miles per hour in early versions to over 425 miles per hour in late war variants. The FBMKS could reach 378 miles per hour at 13,200 feet, while carrying a 2,000-pound bomb load. Even loaded, it was faster than most fighters. The comparison between the Mosquito and other twin-engine fighters of the era highlights just how exceptional the British aircraft was. The German Messerschmitt 110, which had been designed as a heavy fighter, was slower, less manoeuvrable, and carried less effective armament. The American P-38 Lightning, a capable aircraft in its own right, couldn't match the Mosquito's speed at altitude or its range. The Japanese had no equivalent aircraft at all. Only the German T-154, explicitly designed to counter the Mosquito, came close to matching its performance, and the T-154 program was plagued by production problems and never reached significant numbers before the war ended. The Mosquito's success forced German industry and the Luftwaffe to respond, but the responses came too late and were too limited to matter. The Heinkel 219 night fighter, which entered service in 1943, was an excellent aircraft capable of matching the Mosquito in performance and exceeding it in firepower. But only 300 were built before war's end, compared to over 7,000 Mosquitoes. The Dornier Do 335, a radical push-pull design that could exceed 470 miles per hour, was potentially faster than any Mosquito, but it didn't enter service until 1945 and fewer than 40 were completed. The Theon 54, Germany's wooden wonder that was explicitly designed as a Mosquito equivalent, suffered catastrophic structural failures due to defective glue and was cancelled after only 50 were built. The fundamental problem for Germany was that countering the Mosquito required either developing new aircraft types or modifying existing fighters for high-altitude performance, and by 1943 German industry was already stretched to breaking point. Resources that might have gone into Mosquito countermeasures instead went into producing more fighters to counter American daylight bomber raids, more night fighters to counter RAF heavy bombers, and ground attack aircraft for the Eastern Front. The Mosquito, precisely because it was so versatile and operated in so many different roles, forced the Germans to disperse their countermeasures across multiple aircraft types and tactical situations. It was death by 1,000 cuts. No single Mosquito operation would win the war, but the cumulative effect of hundreds of Mosquito missions was to stretch German defences past the breaking point. The operations over Germany in 1944 and 1945 demonstrated the Mosquito's evolution into a weapon of strategic importance. Light night striking. Force, consisting entirely of Mosquito bombers, conducted nightly raids on German cities, forcing millions of Germans into air raid shelters and disrupting war production. These raids were timed to arrive shortly before RAF heavy bomber raids, ensuring that German defences were already activated and depleted when the main force arrived. Mosquitoes would also conduct nuisance raids in areas far from the main target, forcing German fighters to be dispersed across a wide area. The psychological effect was devastating. Germans could never know whether air raid sirens meant a single nuisance raid by a few Mosquitoes or a major attack by hundreds of heavy bombers. Everyone had to shelter regardless, costing millions of man-hours of production. The precision marking conducted by Pathfinder Mosquitoes made the RAF night bombing campaign far more effective than it had been in early war. Previously, night bombing had been wildly inaccurate, with bombs falling miles from their intended targets. But Mosquitoes equipped with oboe, a radio navigation system accurate to within hundreds of yards, could mark targets with coloured flares that following bombers could aim for. The result was a dramatic increase in bombing accuracy. Attacks that previously would have caused generalised damage across an entire city could now destroy specific factory complexes or rail yards. The Germans responded by creating fake fires and decoy markers, but experienced Pathfinder crews learned to distinguish real markers from fake ones. The Mosquito intruders, specialised night fighter versions that patrolled over German airfields, waiting for German night fighters to land, created a terror campaign that had effects far beyond the number of German aircraft destroyed. German night fighter pilots returning from missions, low on fuel and ammunition, would find British Mosquitoes circling their own airfields, shooting down aircraft in the landing pattern. This forced German fighters to divert to alternate airfields, consuming precious fuel and creating logistical nightmares. Some German pilots were shot down while attempting to land, visible against their own airfield lights. Others crashed attempting to land without lights to avoid being spotted. The psychological effect was severe. German aircrews could never feel safe, even over their own bases. Oberleutnant Heinz Schnaufer, the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring night fighter ace with 121 confirmed victories, encountered Mosquito intruders on multiple occasions. He described them as ghosts, appearing suddenly in darkness, firing a devastating burst of cannon fire and vanishing before defenders could respond. Schnaufer survived the war, but many of his colleagues did not. The intruder campaign claimed hundreds of German aircraft, but more importantly it claimed thousands of hours of sleep and added enormous stress to already exhausted German crews. The cumulative effect of constant threat, even in areas that should have been safe, degraded German combat effectiveness in ways that are difficult to quantify but were certainly significant. The technical analysis of captured Mosquitoes by German engineers revealed just how sophisticated the British aircraft was. The wooden construction was not primitive but highly advanced, using lamination techniques and composite structures that were ahead of German capabilities. The engine installation was exceptionally clean, with careful attention to cooling and aerodynamics that minimized drag. The electrical and hydraulic systems were reliable and well designed. The control systems were harmonized to provide excellent handling across the entire flight envelope. German engineers grudgingly admitted that the Mosquito represented world-class aircraft design, and that Germany had underestimated British technical capabilities. The question of why Germany never successfully countered the Mosquito has multiple answers. Partly it was the distributed production system that made Mosquitoes almost impossible to eliminate through bombing. Partly it was the versatility that forced Germans to counter the Mosquito in multiple roles simultaneously. Partly it was performance that exceeded German fighters in the areas that mattered most, speed and altitude. But fundamentally, it was timing. The Mosquito entered service in numbers just as Germany was losing its qualitative edge in the air war. German fighters in 1942 were still competitive with Allied types. By 1944, Allied fighters had closed the gap and were beginning to exceed German capabilities. The Mosquito was at the forefront of this transition. The comparison with the American B-26 Marauder, another twin-engine bomber that initially had a terrible reputation, is instructive. The B-26 was fast and capable, but it was unforgiving of pilot error and had high accident rates during training. It earned the nickname Widowmaker and almost was cancelled. But unlike the Mosquito, the B-26 was never truly loved by its crews. It was respected for its capabilities, but it was a difficult aircraft to master. The Mosquito, by contrast, was almost universally loved by its crews. Pilots praised its handling, navigators appreciated the spacious crew compartment, ground crews valued its reliability. The Mosquito was an aircraft that did everything well and nothing poorly. This intangible quality, the fact that it was simply a pleasure to fly, contributed to its success in ways that are difficult to measure but were certainly important. The post-war service of the Mosquito extended well into the jet age, with some variants serving into the 1960s. This longevity is remarkable given that the basic design dated to 1938. The reason was simple. No jet aircraft in the immediate post-war period could match the Mosquito's combination of range, payload, and operating economics for many missions. A Mosquito could carry out reconnaissance or strike missions for a fraction of the cost of operating early jets and do it more reliably. Some air forces concluded that the Mosquito was more useful than the early jets, and kept them in service accordingly. The Israeli Air Force operated Mosquitoes during the 1948 War of Independence, using them for bombing and reconnaissance. The RAF used Mosquitoes for target marking until 1956. The last operational Mosquito flight by any military occurred in 1963, an extraordinary service life for an aircraft built from wood and glue. The legacy of the Mosquito extends beyond its combat record. It demonstrated that unconventional solutions could work if properly executed. The British built a world-class combat aircraft from a material everyone else had dismissed as obsolete, and that aircraft outperformed metal designs by wide margins. This lesson influenced post-war thinking about materials and construction techniques. The Mosquito also demonstrated the value of speed over defensive armament for bombers. The entire philosophy of building heavily armed bombers that could fight their way through defences was challenged by an unarmed bomber that simply outran threats. Post-war bomber designs increasingly emphasise speed and altitude over defensive guns. The survivors of the Mosquito era, both German and British, have provided valuable first-hand accounts of what it was like to fly these aircraft or face them in combat. Group Captain Leonard Cheshire, one of the RAF's most decorated pilots, flew Mosquitoes extensively and described them as the finest aircraft he ever flew. He particularly praised the handling, noting that the Mosquito could be flown precisely enough to bomb from very low altitude, something almost impossible in heavy bombers. German pilots who faced Mosquitoes consistently described them as the most difficult targets they encountered. Fast, manoeuvrable for a twin-engine aircraft and flown by skilled crews who knew how to exploit every advantage the design provided. The production numbers tell their own story about the Mosquito's importance. Of the 7,181 Mosquitoes built during the war, the distribution across variants shows how versatile the design was. Over 2,500 were bomber variants, more than 2,000 were fighter bombers, nearly 800 were night fighters, and over 700 were dedicated photo reconnaissance aircraft. The remainder were trainers, transports, and specialised variants. This distribution across roles shows that the Mosquito wasn't just good at one mission. It was genuinely excellent at multiple different missions, something no other aircraft achieved to the same degree. The comparison of loss rates between Mosquitoes and heavy bombers is stark. Mosquito bomber operations typically saw loss rates below 1% per mission. Heavy bomber operations often saw loss rates of 3 to 6% per mission, sometimes higher during particularly difficult operations. Over the course of a 30-mission tour, a Lancaster bomber crew had roughly a 50-50 chance of surviving. A Mosquito crew had better than 70% chance of completing their tour. This difference was directly attributable to speed. Mosquitoes were simply too fast for most German fighters to catch, and when they were caught, they often could escape. Heavy bombers, once caught, had to fight it out with no guarantee of survival. The tonnage of bombs dropped by Mosquitoes was relatively small compared to heavy bombers, approximately 27,000 tons total. But the cost-effectiveness was remarkable. Each ton of bombs delivered by Mosquitoes cost far less in terms of aircraft lost, crew casualties, and resources consumed than tons delivered by heavy bombers. For certain target types, particularly precision targets where accuracy mattered more than tonnage, Mosquitoes were arguably the most effective bombers of the war. A single Mosquito delivering a 2,000-pound bomb load precisely on target was more valuable than 100 heavy bombers scattering thousands of tons across a general area. The development of specialised munitions for the Mosquito expanded its capabilities even further. The 4,000-pound cookie bomb, normally carried by heavy bombers, could be carried by late-war Mosquito variants modified with bulged bomb bays. This gave the Mosquito the ability to deliver the blast effect of a heavy bomber while retaining all its speed and manoeuvrability advantages. High-velocity rockets turned the Mosquito into a formidable anti-shipping weapon. The 57mm cannon of the Setze variant could sink submarines and destroy armoured vehicles. Specialised marker bombs for Pathfinder operations allowed precise target marking from high altitude. Each new weapon system expanded the Mosquito's repertoire. The night photography missions flown by Mosquitoes deserve special mention because they combined extreme danger with tremendous intelligence value. These aircraft would fly over German-occupied territory at night, at very low altitude, using photo flash bombs to illuminate targets while photographing them. The flash bombs created momentary daylight, allowing high-resolution photography of targets like bridges, railways, and industrial sites. but the flash also revealed the Mosquito's position to every anti-aircraft gun in the area. The seconds after the flash was the most dangerous moment, as flak gunners fired at where they'd seen the aircraft. Mosquito crews would light their target, photograph it while enemy fire converged on their position, and then escape using speed and darkness. The photographs obtained this way were invaluable for planning raids and assessing damage. The evolution of German tactics against the Mosquito shows how difficult the aircraft was to counter. Initially, German fighters attempted conventional interceptions, trying to climb to altitude and catch Mosquitoes from favourable positions. This rarely worked because the Mosquito was faster and could simply run away. Then Germans tried positioning fighters at maximum altitude over likely targets, waiting for Mosquitoes to appear below. This occasionally worked but consumed enormous amounts of fuel and could only cover limited areas. Finally, Germans resorted to mass fighter deployments, sending up dozens of fighters in hopes that one might get lucky and catch a Mosquito. This was wasteful and largely ineffective, but there were no better options. The Mosquito's performance envelope was such that interception was always difficult and often impossible. The personal accounts from Mosquito crews emphasize how much they trusted their aircraft. Unlike heavy bomber crews who knew they were flying in vulnerable targets, Mosquito crews felt they had a fighting chance in any situation. The speed gave them confidence. If things went wrong, they could usually run away. The handling gave them control. The aircraft responded precisely to control inputs, allowing accurate flying in difficult conditions. The reliability meant they could depend on their aircraft. Engine failures were rare, systems worked consistently, and the airframe could absorb damage without catastrophic failure. This trust translated to aggressive tactics and impressive operational results. The Mosquito's contribution to winning the war is difficult to quantify precisely, but was certainly significant. The photo reconnaissance missions provided intelligence that guided strategy. The Pathfinder operations made bomber raids more effective. The night fighter operations blunted German bombing campaigns against Britain. The intruder operations disrupted German night fighter defences. The bomber operations struck targets that heavy bombers couldn't hit without unacceptable collateral damage. The anti-shipping operations sank vessels and disrupted German logistics. No single Mosquito mission changed the course of the war, but thousands of Mosquito missions collectively had strategic impact. When German pilots laughed at the Mosquito in 1941, they were making the same mistake that the British Air Ministry had made when it initially rejected the design. They assumed that a wooden aircraft couldn't be effective, that modern war required modern materials. They assumed that a bomber without guns was defenceless and would be easy prey. They assumed that British aircraft design was inferior to German. All of these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. The Mosquito was effective precisely because it ignored conventional wisdom and pursued performance through aerodynamic efficiency rather than brute force. It was revolutionary in being evolutionary, taking proven technologies like the Merlin engine and wooden construction and combining them in ways that created something genuinely new. By 1943, no German pilot was laughing at the Mosquito. By 1944, encountering one was a nightmare scenario that usually ended badly for the Germans. By 1945, the Mosquito was an established fact of aerial warfare, as dominant in its roles as the Spitfire had been in 1940. The transformation from joke to terror weapon took less than 2 years. In that time, the wooden wonder, designed by a small British company and built by furniture makers, proved that the fundamental assumptions about modern combat aircraft were wrong. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany provides the clearest demonstration of how the Mosquito changed the calculus of aerial warfare. In 1942 and early 1943, RAF Bomber Command was suffering terrible losses in its night campaign against German cities and industrial targets. Loss rates of 5 to 6% per mission were common, sometimes reaching 8 or 9% on particularly difficult operations. At those rates, the mathematical probability of a crew surviving a 30-mission tour was grim. Most bomber crews were killed, wounded, or captured before completing their tours. The human cost was staggering, with Bomber Command suffering over 55,000 killed during the war, the highest casualty rate of any British service. The Mosquito offered an alternative. Operating at high altitude and high speed, Mosquito bombers could strike targets throughout Germany, with loss rates typically under 1%. True, each Mosquito carried only 2,000 pounds of bombs compared to the 14,000 pounds a Lancaster could carry, but the Mosquito could make multiple trips while the Lancaster made one, and the Mosquito would probably survive where the Lancaster would not. The mathematics of attrition warfare favoured the faster, more survivable aircraft. 100 Mosquitoes making 3 trips each with 2-ton bomb loads delivered more tonnage than 100 Lancasters making 1 trip with 7-ton loads, if losses meant that only half the Lancasters survived. But the Mosquito's real value wasn't in replacing heavy bombers. It was in doing things heavy bombers couldn't do at all. The precision strikes on Gestapo headquarters, the attacks on specific buildings in occupied cities, the disruption of German air defences through nuisance raids, the systematic destruction of German transportation infrastructure through railway interdiction. These missions required an aircraft that combined speed, accuracy, and the ability to operate in heavily defended airspace. No heavy bomber could do what the Mosquito did routinely. The Germans tried to replicate these capabilities and failed. The G-88 was fast for a bomber, but not fast enough. The R-234 jet bomber came close but arrived too late, and in too few numbers to matter. The technological sophistication hidden within the Mosquito's apparently simple wooden structure deserves deeper examination. Modern analysis of surviving Mosquitoes has revealed construction techniques that were genuinely advanced for their era. The birch plywood skins were laid up with grains running in alternating directions, creating a composite material with strength properties approaching modern carbon fibre in some aspects. The balsa core provided crush resistance and prevented buckling failures that would have doomed pure plywood structures. The adhesives used were casein-based initially, later replaced by synthetic resins that provided better water resistance and high-temperature performance. The entire structure was incredibly efficient, using minimal material to achieve maximum strength. The attention to aerodynamic detail was obsessive. Every rivet, every panel gap, every protrusion was minimized or eliminated. The engine cowlings were designed to provide maximum cooling with minimum drag. The wing fuselage junction was carefully blended to prevent separation and turbulence. Even small details like the shape of the exhaust stubs and the fairings around the landing gear contributed to the overall low-drag design. The result was an aircraft with a drag coefficient comparable to high-performance racing aircraft of the era. This was why 2 Merlin engines, the same engines that powered single-engine fighters, could push the Mosquito to speeds exceeding those fighters. The Mosquito simply cheated less air than other aircraft. The pilots who flew Mosquitoes developed techniques that exploited every aspect of the aircraft's performance. The standard defensive maneuver when bounced by German fighters was to push the nose down slightly, accelerating to maximum speed while simultaneously beginning a gentle climb. The Mosquito's excellent power-to-weight ratio meant it could accelerate while climbing, something most aircraft could not do. By the time German fighters reached firing position, the Mosquito would be several miles away, and climbing through altitudes where the German fighters were gasping for air. Pilots called this the Mosquito zoom. It worked so consistently that it became standard operating procedure. When threatened, zoom, climb away. Simple, effective, and almost impossible for German fighters to counter. The night-flying characteristics of the Mosquito were exceptional, another factor in its success as a night fighter and night bomber. The side-by-side seating arrangement put both crew members at the aircraft's centre of gravity, improving comfort during long flights. The greenhouse canopy provided excellent visibility in all directions, critical for spotting enemy aircraft at night. The engine note was relatively quiet for such a powerful aircraft, making it harder for enemy crews to hear the Mosquito approaching, and the twin-engine layout provided a safety margin that single-engine night fighters lacked. If one engine failed, the Mosquito could continue flying on one engine, limping home on half power. This happened numerous times, and in almost every case the aircraft made it back to base safely. The specialised versions developed for specific missions showed how adaptable the basic airframe was. The PR SMK-34, the ultimate photo reconnaissance variant, had a maximum speed of 425 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 43,000 feet. These aircraft routinely flew the length of Germany photographing targets and were almost never intercepted successfully. The FB-Mk-26, developed late in the war, carried 8 rockets plus bombs, and had provisions for drop tanks that extended its range to over 1,500 miles. The NFMAC-30, the final night fighter variant, had American AI MKX radar that could detect targets at 5 miles, 4 20mm Hispano cannon, and performance that exceeded every other night fighter in service. Each variant took the basic Mosquito formula and optimized it for a specific role. The crew coordination required to operate a Mosquito effectively was demanding but rewarding. The pilot handled flying and navigation, while the navigator operated the radar, worked the bomb sight, and managed defensive systems. The two crew members had to work as a seamless team, communicating constantly, backing each other up and dividing tasks efficiently. The best Mosquito crews developed an almost telepathic understanding, anticipating each other's needs and actions. This level of coordination took time to develop, which is why experienced Mosquito crews were so valuable. A crew that had flown together for months could accomplish things that would be impossible for a newly formed crew. The comparison with German night fighter crews is instructive. German night fighters typically had 3 crew members, a pilot, a radar operator, and a rear gunner. The Mosquito night fighters had only 2 crew and no defensive armament. Yet Mosquito night fighters were more effective than their German counterparts, despite having fewer people and guns. The reason was performance. The Mosquito could position itself perfectly for an attack, using its speed and climb rate to get into ideal firing position before opening fire. German night fighters were often forced to attack from suboptimal positions because they couldn't maneuver as well. The Mosquito's 4 cannon delivered such devastating firepower that one good burst was usually enough. German night fighters often needed multiple attacks to down a bomber, giving the bomber crew time to take evasive action or call for help. The anti-shipping operations conducted by Mosquitoes in 1944 and 1945 demonstrated yet another capability. Coastal Command FBMK-6, operating over the North Sea and Norwegian coast, attacked German coastal convoys with rockets and bombs, sinking or damaging hundreds of vessels. These operations were conducted at wave-top height, the Mosquitoes roaring in at over 300 miles per hour just feet above the water. German ships equipped with anti-aircraft guns could barely track the fast-moving targets before they were overhead. By the time gunners reacted, the Mosquitoes had already launched their rockets and were racing away. Some Mosquitoes carried the 57mm anti-tank gun that could punch through any ship's armour at close range. A single hit from this weapon could sink a minesweeper or seriously damage a destroyer. The training pipeline for Mosquito crews reflected the aircraft's demanding nature. Unlike heavy bombers where crews could include relatively inexperienced personnel in some positions, every Mosquito crew member needed to be highly skilled. Pilots required extensive multi-engine time and needed to demonstrate exceptional handling skills. Navigators needed to be expert in radar operation, navigation, and weapon systems. The training took months, but the result was crews who could operate their aircraft at maximum efficiency. The investment in training paid off in combat effectiveness. Well-trained Mosquito crews achieved success rates that poorly trained crews could never match. The maintenance requirements for the Mosquito were surprisingly reasonable given its high performance. The wooden structure required careful monitoring for moisture damage and required regular treatment with protective coatings, but was otherwise quite durable. The Merlin engines were well understood and relatively easy to maintain, with established overhaul procedures and good parts availability. The systems were straightforward and accessible. Ground crews who maintained Mosquitoes generally praised the aircraft for being reliable and easy to work on. This was another hidden advantage. An aircraft that spent less time in maintenance could fly more missions, increasing its combat effectiveness beyond what raw performance numbers suggested. The adaptation of the Mosquito to different theatres and conditions showed how robust the basic design was. Mosquitoes operated in the freezing conditions of northern Norway, the desert heat of North Africa, and the tropical humidity of Southeast Asia. Each environment presented challenges for a wooden aircraft, but with appropriate modifications the Mosquito proved capable of operating anywhere. Desert Mosquitoes had additional engine cooling and air filters to deal with sand. Tropical variants had modified glues and protective coatings to resist humidity. Cold weather Mosquitoes had engine heaters and modified oils for reliable starting in sub-zero temperatures. The fact that the same basic airframe could be adapted to such diverse conditions speaks to the fundamental soundness of the design. The jet age presented an interesting question about the Mosquito's future. When the first British jet fighters entered service in 1944, many observers predicted that piston-engine aircraft would rapidly become obsolete. Yet the Mosquito continued in frontline service for years after jets became available. The reason was practical economics. A Mosquito could conduct a reconnaissance or strike mission for a fraction of the operating cost of early jets, which were notoriously fuel-hungry and had limited range. For many missions, the Mosquito was simply more cost-effective than jets. It wasn't until the late 1950s that jet aircraft had advanced enough in range and efficiency that they could truly replace the Mosquito in all its roles. The diplomatic impact of the Mosquito is sometimes overlooked, but was significant. The aircraft was exported to numerous Allied air forces during and after the war. The Royal Canadian Air Force operated Mosquitoes extensively, including building over 1,000 under license in Canada. The Royal Australian Air Force used Mosquitoes in the Pacific Theatre with great success. The United States Army Air Forces evaluated the Mosquito and nearly adopted it, but decided that American aircraft better suited their needs. However, American pilots who flew Mosquitoes in RAF service were universally impressed. The aircraft's success burnished Britain's reputation for aircraft design and helped maintain British influence in international aviation, despite increasing American dominance. The intelligence gathered by Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft had strategic implications throughout the war. PR Mosquitoes photographed the German V-weapon research facilities at Peenemünde, providing intelligence that led to bombing raids that delayed the V-weapon program by months. They photographed the Murnau and Eder dams before the famous Dambusters raid, providing critical targeting information. They located German capital ships, guiding strike aircraft and naval forces to intercept them. They assessed bomb damage after major raids, helping planners determine whether targets needed to be hit again. The photographs taken by these unarmed wooden aircraft shaped Allied strategy at the highest levels. The propaganda value of the Mosquito was considerable. The RAF publicised Mosquito operations extensively, portraying them as examples of British ingenuity and technological prowess. The fact that a wooden aircraft could outperform German metal fighters became a narrative about British determination and resourcefulness, overcoming German industrial might. This narrative was somewhat misleading. The Mosquito was actually a highly sophisticated aircraft built using advanced techniques, but it played well with public audiences. The Germans responded with their own propaganda, downplaying Mosquito effectiveness and claiming extensive German successes against them. Neither side's propaganda was entirely accurate, but both recognised that the Mosquito had public relations value beyond its military impact. The accidents and losses suffered by Mosquito units, while low compared to heavy bombers, still amounted to hundreds of aircraft and crew. Some losses were due to mechanical failure, others to weather, still others to German action. The wooden construction, while generally robust, was vulnerable to certain failure modes that metal aircraft did not experience. Glue joints could fail if improperly manufactured, or if the aircraft was stored in conditions that degraded the adhesives. Moisture infiltration could rot the wood structure from inside, creating invisible weaknesses. Insect damage was a concern in tropical environments. These issues required constant vigilance from ground crews and sometimes resulted in aircraft being grounded for extensive structural inspections. Combat losses were inevitable despite the Mosquito's speed advantage. German fighters occasionally caught Mosquitoes through skilled positioning or bad luck. Anti-aircraft fire claimed numerous Mosquitoes, especially those conducting low-altitude strikes where they had to fly through intense flak. Weather claimed more, with Mosquitoes sometimes lost due to icing, fog or storms that even skilled crews couldn't survive. Each loss represented not just an aircraft, but a crew of 2 highly trained men whose experience and skill could never be replaced. The RAF tracked Mosquito losses carefully and constantly refined tactics to minimize them, but some level of attrition was unavoidable in combat operations. The post-war fate of surviving Mosquitoes varied widely. Many were simply scrapped, the wooden airframes deteriorating rapidly once regular maintenance ceased. The wood structure that had been an advantage during the war became a liability in peacetime. Unlike metal aircraft that could sit outside for years and then be restored, wooden aircraft rotted quickly if not stored properly. This is why relatively few Mosquitoes survive today compared to metal aircraft like Spitfires and Mustangs. The survivors that were carefully preserved are now priceless artifacts, representing one of the most successful aircraft designs of World War II. The technical legacy of the Mosquito influenced post-war aircraft design in subtle but important ways. The emphasis on aerodynamic cleanliness influenced designers who came after. The idea that an aircraft could be optimized for multiple roles rather than being a pure specialist influenced the development of multi-role fighters. The demonstration that wooden construction could produce world-class performance encouraged experimentation with composite materials, eventually leading to the carbon fibre and advanced composites used in modern aircraft. While no post-war aircraft was a direct descendant of the Mosquito, the lessons learned from it influenced an entire generation of designers. The veterans of Mosquito operations formed associations after the war to preserve the memory of their aircraft and comrades. The Mosquito Aircrew Association, formed in the 1950s, brought together pilots and navigators who had flown the aircraft in combat. Their reunions and newsletters kept the story alive as the generation that fought the war aged and passed away. Similar organisations existed for ground crew and other personnel associated with the Mosquito. These groups worked to preserve surviving aircraft, support museum displays, and ensure that the Mosquito's contribution to victory was not forgotten. Their efforts have been largely successful. Today, the Mosquito is recognised as one of the iconic aircraft of World War II, mentioned in the same breath as the Spitfire, Mustang and Lancaster. The question of whether the Mosquito was the best aircraft of World War II is ultimately subjective and depends on how one defines best. In pure performance terms, other aircraft exceeded it in specific areas. Jet fighters were faster, heavy bombers carried more payload, purpose-built fighters could outturn it. But no other aircraft combined so many capabilities at such high levels of performance. The Mosquito could bomb, fight, scout and strike with equal effectiveness. It could operate in any theatre, any weather, any altitude. It could be maintained under field conditions with limited resources. It could be produced without consuming strategic materials. These qualities taken together make a strong case that the Mosquito was indeed one of the finest aircraft of the war. The German recognition of the Mosquito's superiority came grudgingly but definitively. By late 1944, Luftwaffe combat reports routinely describe Mosquitoes as extremely dangerous and difficult to counter. Tactical bulletins warned pilots that engaging Mosquitoes should be avoided unless conditions were ideal. Intelligence assessments rank the Mosquito among the most threatening Allied aircraft. This was a remarkable evolution from the derision of 1941. The wooden aircraft that German pilots had laughed at had become the aircraft they most feared to encounter. The transformation was complete. The final months of the war saw Mosquitoes operating with almost complete impunity over Germany. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a spent force, short of fuel, short of pilots, short of aircraft. Mosquitoes ranged across Germany attacking targets of opportunity, conducting reconnaissance, and supporting advancing Allied ground forces. The speed that had been such an advantage earlier in the war was now almost unnecessary. There were so few German fighters left that Mosquitoes could have flown slowly and still completed their missions. But they continued to fly fast, because that was what Mosquitoes did. Speed was not just a tactic, it was the essence of what made the Mosquito successful. In the final accounting, the Mosquito's impact on the war can be measured in multiple dimensions. Thousands of reconnaissance photographs providing intelligence that shaped Allied strategy. Hundreds of precision strikes on targets that could not have been attacked any other way. Thousands of German aircraft destroyed or damaged. Tens of thousands of German vehicles, locomotives and ships destroyed. Millions of German workers forced into shelters by nuisance raids. Hundreds of Allied bomber raids made more effective by Pathfinder marking. The cost was 254 Mosquitoes, lost to all causes in Bomber Command Service, plus additional losses in other commands. This represents a loss rate far below any other bomber type, and demonstrates the fundamental soundness of the speed over armour philosophy that the Mosquito embodied. When Geoffrey de Havilland proposed building a wooden bomber in 1938, he was told it was impossible, impractical and unnecessary. When the prototype flew in 1940, skeptics predicted it would be a failure. When the first combat units formed in 1941, German pilots laughed at the ungainly wooden aircraft. By 1943, those same German pilots were filing combat reports, describing an aircraft they could not catch and could not counter. By 1945, the Mosquito was recognised as one of the finest combat aircraft of the war. The journey from derision to domination took less than 4 years. In that time, the wooden wonder proved that conventional wisdom was wrong, that speed could substitute for armour, that versatility could be achieved without compromise, and that British engineering could produce world-beating designs. The Mosquito changed how air forces thought about combat aircraft. It demonstrated that the bomber would always get through if it was fast enough. It showed that defensive armament was dead weight if the aircraft could simply outrun attackers. It proved that wooden construction could produce performance equal or superior to metal. These lessons influenced post-war thinking and helped shape the aircraft that followed. The legacy of the Mosquito extends far beyond its combat record. It represents a philosophy of aircraft design that prioritized performance over protection, speed over firepower, and elegance over brute force. This philosophy produced one of the most successful aircraft of World War II and ensured that when German pilots thought about the Mosquito, they were no longer laughing. They were running.